Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out and get ready to learn something about expanded polystyrene, not styrofoam. That is a brand name. Don't want to get sued, I'd like to give a shout out to the team and our faculty advisors for all the hard work they've done this semester. I think we've put together a great project and a nice series of recommendations for our client. So what's the scope of our project? Our client is the Town and Gown program from the Department of Design and Construction for New York City. DDC oversees the managing and construction for most of the infrastructure and public buildings in the city. They came to us hoping to develop some good strategies for sustainably managing expanded polystyrene in New York City with the eventual hope of incorporating it into their own internal construction processes. So what is EPS? EPS, which is the acronym I'll be using now on for expanded polystyrene, is a rigid foam material made up of individual polystyrene beads. You know it from packaging for TVs and other electronics, from medical transportation, from food like raw meat and fish. It's an excellent insulator and holds rigid shapes, so it's very valuable in industry and it's very cheap to make. However, it is an environmental nightmare. Due to its chemical composition, it doesn't biodegrade ever, basically. It just continues to break down to these smaller and smaller beads. You can see them walking around in litter, blowing in the streets, thousands of individual polystyrene beads that get everywhere. And those beads just break down to smaller and smaller beads kind of ad infinitum. So it's an environmental nightmare that needs to be kind of addressed. And that was kind of our hope here. So when our client first came to us, we realized that we needed to more fully understand how polystyrene is treated in the city as it is right now. So waste is processed in New York through kind of two main streams, the residential and commercial streams. The Department of Sanitation is responsible for the residential collection of waste, but all commercial waste in the city, so that's anything that a company throws away, is handled by private contractors. So it becomes a bit more of a black box. We were able to kind of fully better understand the residential stream through waste characterization studies done by DSNY and kind of monthly publishings that they did of total waste tonnage. Commercial streams we kind of dealt with through both recommendations from DSNY on kind of how to interpret some of the data, as well as some policy implementations that have been done in the last 5 years. Finally, we also read a lot of the literature on the EPS life cycle to more understand the environmental impacts and kind of longevity that we see as it persists in our environment. So what does EPS look like in New York City at this moment? Currently, long story short, when it gets picked up by the garbage trucks, they either dump it into the landfill or burn it. That's it. So it's either in the landfill, it's getting burned for energy, or it ends up in our waterways for the most part. Due to its kind of extremely light nature, it's very easily transported by both water and air. So even if it does end up in the landfill, right, it just keeps on decomposing into these smaller pieces, which are then carried by, air, water, whatever, and eventually make their way into our natural environment. On the commercial side, this sort of the amount of EPS was kind of addressed through a few policy actions taken by New York City and New York State. Originally in 2015, New York City, the city itself, the city government, stopped all distribution of EPS-made products as a part of its own operations. In 2019, a ban was passed by the city that disallowed any food vendors from using kind of those clamshell styrofoam containers that we're kind of familiar with. In 2022, this ban was spread throughout New York State, which focused which banned all commercial uses of EPS with a few exceptions. On the bottom here, this is based on the waste characterization study. We can see the effects of the policy in the residential stream. The distribution of EPS halved from 2017 to 2023 after the two bans were put into place, showing a steep decrease in the use of EPS, at least within the residential stream. So based on kind of this data that we found and the persistent use of EPS even after the bans, we decided to focus on how can we encourage recycling and how can we promote that for the city. We decided to look at kind of three individual policy options that we could propose a suite of a menu of options for the city to pursue. So those three those three kind of streams of focus we studied were extended producer responsibility, which is a sort of broad view policy that puts the onus back onto producers and companies to provide recycling options for consumers for certain materials. Then we looked at an additional collection stream, which is based on DSNY's rollout of the two-stream recycling program about 20 years ago to integrate a EPS-specific collection stream. And finally, we looked at densification of EPS and how to promote that within the city. I will explain what that means in just a minute. So for the additional collection stream, we kind of approached this with two different scenarios to try to fully understand what it would cost for the city to incorporate this. In the first scenario, the city would buy one single electric truck whose job would be just to rove around the city and pick up EPS. That had a very high upfront cost with decreased costs throughout the year or throughout the years over the lifespan of the truck, which is about 12 years. However, this is still very expensive at around $4,000 per ton and 11,500 tons per year of EPS. That's a lot of waste to deal with. The second was utilizing the current biodiesel trucks. While this showed lower upfront costs as we were utilizing the pre-existing fleet, $1,000 per ton is still a very high cost for the city to bear to try to redeploy trucks just for the specific purpose of picking up one material. Next, we need to understand densification as a process. So due to EPS's chemical and kind of physical makeup, it's really hard to recycle. It's about 90% air, so the material itself is very cheap, very hard to transport, and it's hard to use and sell in secondary markets. Densification is a process that makes it into something that companies actually want. So quite literally, it densifies it. It takes all the EPS, you feed it into that machine, and then it compresses it into these logs. And then once you compress it into these ultra-dense logs, you're able to transport it and resell it on secondary markets. The price of it is still cheap relative to a lot of the other kind of main recyclable products we see, with prices kind of hovering around 20 cents per pound, which makes it economically difficult for a lot of producers and municipalities to justify recycling. So we decided to look at the viability of this given these kind of economic constraints. We looked at it under the two streams I've talked about, the residential and the commercial kind of areas. So for the residential, we looked at the DSNY special waste sites. So these are 5 pre-existing locations that are owned and operated by DSNY for dropping off very specific waste products that cannot or should not be kind of processed in the traditional streams. Things like batteries, electronics, paint, stuff like that. So we looked at incorporating densifiers into these pre-existing properties to allow civic-minded New Yorkers who wanted to drop off the EPS. From a pure financial standpoint, if you only care about profit, let's say, this is not going to be a profitable enterprise. The densifiers each cost around $50,000 to $60,000 per year, and we sort of expect not extremely high participation from residential consumers based on past efforts. This would require each densifier would need 35,000 pounds per year to break even, and that feels pretty optimistic. We didn't incorporate social costs into our sort of cost-benefit analysis. We leave that for the city to do based on our own restraints on research and time. The second and perhaps more likely stream that we found was in the commercial realm. So the main case study we looked at was the Fulton fish market. Fish markets are one of the last exceptions for EPS use in the city. Our estimates say that the Fulton fish market probably goes through around 8,000 tons per year of EPS. With a densifier on site, that becomes $2.7 million in densified material. We don't know the economics of the Fulton fish market. However, it would indicate that there would be hopefully a bit more opportunity for a public-private partnership to encourage densification on these sites. What are the barriers to implementation for some of these strategies? The first is the high expense for additional collection and processing infrastructure. If you know anything about the city, it's really hard to get funding for anything, especially large upfront costs for small problems like EPS. The second is the administrative complexity of EPR of extended producer responsibility policies, and stakeholder cooperation. As I mentioned, for the DSNY waste sites, it's hard to encourage New Yorkers to go out of their way to recycle EPS. And similarly, it's hard to encourage producers to take responsibility for the plastic waste they bring into the city. Finally, this is probably one of the most paradoxical things I've seen in a while. The success of the recent EPS bans has made recycling less economically viable in New York City. The bans were so successful that they have, in having the amount of EPS in the city, that they reduced the amount of second market material available. So if you have half as much to sell, you're not going to be able to justify economically the investment in recycling. So what are our final recommendations? We had two main recommendations, one for the short term and one hopefully a longer term solution. The first is investing in densification on these special waste sites. As I mentioned before, these are 5 sites throughout New York City, 1 in each borough. And essentially, you would just put a densifier on this pre-existing property, which would cost around $50,000 per densifier. While we understand that this has a low likelihood of making a large dent in EPS, it at least diverts some of the existing EPS from our waste streams and gives New Yorkers an opportunity to participate in recycling and hopefully for DDC to have densified material that they could later use for construction projects and insulation for buildings. The second and the more long-term solution that we were trying to encourage is a policy that would require collection sites at major retail stores. So a similar policy is already in effect in New York that requires large firms to have a return site for plastic bags and plastic films. This would be very similar, in which any company that would be using or bringing in EPS as a part of their business would be required to have a drop-off site for consumers to return that EPS after consumption. The hope is that, maybe they would be encouraged then to invest in densifiers as well in the long term and turn this into a much healthier kind of ecosystem of recycling and reuse for EPS. And then as a final kind of graphic to more visually explain it, we would maintain the same sort of waste collection system due to the high costs of adding a waste stream, but then encourage densification in these special waste drop-offs, which would then be turned into these dense ingots, which could either be used as construction insulation or packaging or sold on the secondary market for either private use or for the city's own consumptive use. Thank you. Did anybody have any questions?
Awesome job.
Thank you.
Every time. Amazing. So on the barriers to implementation slide, you said that EPS is a small problem. So can you speak to why the DDC, wanted you all to come up with recommendations for it?
I should rephrase. It's not a small problem. It's a small percentage of a very large problem. So as we all know, plastic is a huge issue, and there are probably much easier sort of waste streams to target as it is. EPS, the investment that you would need to make to achieve marginal gains is difficult to sell for a city that is under a budget crisis as it is and has high barriers to infrastructure investment. It's not a small problem. We think it's a very big problem, deserves, that same kind of treatment. However, the political sell of something that is less than 0.5% of the waste stream is tough to make.
My question, I had 2 questions.
Yeah.
One was, this seems very much a DSNY or a sanitation problem. I was curious as to why DDC, who builds things, is interested in this problem and not sanitation or DEP or one of those other, acronyms. And then my second question is, I work for EDC.
Yeah.
And I won't talk about the Fulton Fish Market because they're one of our tenants. But one of my questions is, in the siting of these densifiers, is that right?
Yeah.
Is there any cross-contamination, right? Because Fulton Fish Market, for example, they have raw fish, right? And when we go to these kind of manufacturing and, where things are happening, you'll find like wood chips. Like, is there any possibility in the densification process for those little tiny particles to get into fish or people's lungs? Like, is that a concern in that process?
Yeah. So I would imagine that I'll answer your second question first. So if I understand it, having densification on site, would that lead to health concerns? Or
What is the risk of
yeah.
there to be cross contamination of, like, if you're throwing it into that big machine that's a little tiny part?
Yeah, I think pretty low. It's a pretty well contained machine where, because of the nature of it, they go through like a thermal densification process. So they have to heat up the container and then press it down. So it's not like it's like spewing particles out. And then second, EPS is such a low quality material that it wouldn't be reused for food consumption after. So it's really just the aim would just be to use it in building materials or packaging materials. I feel like we'd have to do a little bit more work if the Fulton Fish Market are interested to understand that was a little bit outside the scope of our project, but it is definitely something to think about when you're dealing with food and putting things in people's bodies, which is the concern of plastic anyways. To answer the first question, I am very glad you asked that because that was something I wanted to get to, but didn't have time. DDC came to us hoping to be able to use EPS in their building process. However, there's a lot of steps that you have to get, obviously a lot of steps you have to take before you can even get to using it again. And so that was kind of what we realized once we started looking into how to use it as a building material, was that there wasn't even an infrastructure in place to make it viable as a building material at all. So while this is basically going to be a DSNY project or, DEP project in the long run, the hope is that by encouraging densification and producing a secondary product, DDC would then be able to use that as they would. Yeah.
Could be something that DEC could go its sanitation of, like, I'll be your customer.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of backtracking where we realize, okay, you can't use any of this until you go through all these processes of having separate collection. Yeah. It's a good question.
This is outside of the scope of your project, but did you have discussions internally about the upstream side, about maybe considering taxing this material to decrease the usage?
Yeah, we had a lot of questions on kind of the difference between encouraging a decrease in use versus encouraging recycling, and that was a tough philosophical sell internally. We felt that these bans that the New York City and New York State passed, New York City passed this ban, their own internal ban back in like 2016, I think. And it took 5 years of lawsuits to even litigate to get into effect within the city. And that kind of push to solve the problem a little bit more. As I mentioned before, a lot of effort for very marginal gains. In addition, the interest of our client wasn't necessarily to reduce consumption. It was to have a reuse program in place. They're interested in reusing this product. And putting a tax on it might just honestly it'd be nice if it didn't exist. I'm going to be honest, but it does exist. And so it's always going to exist in the city, sadly. And so our hope was we need to provide the best outlet to divert it from the waste streams and ending up in the natural environment. Great. Thank you, everybody.